it's Steve, and this is Brainless Raider, a puzzle adventure game made in 3 hours for Trijam 276. In this series, we're going step by step over the process of remaking the game in Bevy, the Rust game engine, in probably closer to 3 months. Last time on this series, we got treasures following the movers around and actually enabled them to do some basic treasure stealing. This time we're going to implement collisions with the exit and do at least the start of transitioning from one level to another. Let's get into it. First of all, you'll actually see here, we're trying to hydrate a component exit with no hydrator. What that means is actually here on the exit, we have a component already tagged in here for exit, but we don't have it implemented anywhere. And that's going to be the key to our initial exit collision. So down at the bottom of our collision functions, let's make a adventure exit collision. So just explaining this function signature, we have commands so that we can spawn our audio sound effect as well as the audio server to get our sound effect from. We have 2 queries for the adventure and the exit, which we're going to use similarly to all the other collisions. And we have an event collision enter reader to pull those collisions from. Let's get into it. And as we see here, we actually said we were going to make a exit tag and then completely forgot to do it. So let's do that real quick. That's going to be very similar to the goblinoided adventurer up here. Okay. Now, yep, we're checking our collision for a collision between an adventure and an exit. And when that happens, we're creating a sound effect and printing out exit. One other thing we need to do real quick is include this in our systems here. And the other thing we need to do that we forgot to do is actually include the exit tag hydrator here. And here and see there, we are in fact colliding with the exit. Cool. So this is of course not the only thing we want to do here. We also want to actually move over to the next level. So in our case, that would be level 1 here, which has some mechanics that we haven't implemented yet, but we're going to get to it later. So we can determine success by when we collide with our exit, we see this map. Before we get too into the actual transition itself, what I'd like to do is move our setup function into a scene module. That way we can have all of our scene management all neatly in one place rather than leaving it in main. So let's do that real quick. So here we have our basic Bevy plugin. Let's go ahead and pull that into main before we do too much more. Now, what are we going to move over to our scene plugin? First of all, let's grab these constants. Next, let's use the setup function, which we're going to rename anyway, but that's alright. For now, we'll keep these helpers in main. That's fine, but we don't need this add system in main. We actually need that in the scene RS. Where am I? And I've actually changed my mind. We want to move these helper functions into the scene since they're being used for scene setting. So as is, this should be able to compile. Let's see. Nope. So movement RS is actually using our coordinate to position. And since that's not a public function, which it should be as a helper. Okay. So now we can confirm that this still works, even though all that has been stripped out of main. Our main looks a lot cleaner. That's very nice. Talking through what we actually want to have happen, we're just going to basically have all of this get deleted from the game world and all of this being added. And we're going to do that every time we go and do a transition between levels. So the reason I included a states section here is the easiest way to do that is to track a state, and we can toggle it over to transitioning when we need to get rid of all of the current active entities, and then we can transition it back to ready or sane set or stable or whatever you want to call it when all those have been added. So basically at the end of this setup, right, we'll transition to stable. But somewhere before this, in a different system, we're going to get rid of a bunch of stuff. Let's define that state. So here's our scene state with our 2 states of stable and transitioning. Now, in order to use this, we need to call init state in the app and pass scene state in like that. Now, I'm going to rename setup to setup scene. And we're actually going to add another system called teardown scene. So in this system, we of course need to pull in commands so we can despawn things. And we need to grab a query of all entities that aren't the window. So this will actually include the camera, it'll include the background loop, as well as all of the entities and tiles we've spawned. But when we tear all those down, we can also call setup to bring them all back in the next scene. So in order to get these systems running when we want them to, of course, as soon as the map load state finishes up, which is map load state done right here, we do want to call setup scene, so we can call our initial level startup. But also, when we enter the transitioning state, we want to call tear down and then setup. So here's how we do that. Here on enter of scene state transitioning, we will call teardown scene and setup scene, and we're going to call .chain on those. And what chain does is actually sequence the systems so they happen one after the other sequentially. This ensures that when we enter transitioning, we immediately tear down the scene, and then after everything has been removed, we start the setup again. So one thing we need to do is, since that's going to put us in the scene state transitioning, we actually need to add some logic to our setup scene to move from transitioning back into stable after everything's been spawned. So let's do that real quick. So here we've pulled in our next state into setup scene and then called set to scene stable to say we're no longer transitioning, now we're stable. Let's cargo run this and see if we run into any issues. Interesting. So that's not even happening. And the reason that's not even happening, obviously, is because we're not actually transitioning into the transitioning state. In order to make that happen, we actually need to pull in the next state into the collision event with the exit here. And then, and we're going to say instead of printing line here, we're just going to do set scene state transitioning. And this will actually get that to happen. So let's see what happens when we run that. So, a couple of points there. Point one, obviously we didn't move to the next scene, we just stayed on the same scene. And point two, the background loop restarted, which makes sense because since we're deleting everything, including the background loop, that actually doesn't persist and in fact gets deleted and re-added. So we want to fix both of those things. Let's start with moving to level 2. The reason that we're reloading level 1 is that here in the setup scene, we're only grabbing the first map from the maps server. So a couple of things we want to do for that. First, let's just rename this to maps so it's less confusing. The original plan was to have a set of map lists for tutorial maps, for, fire zone maps, ice zone maps, etc. But as of right now, it makes a little bit more sense in my brain to keep it to one list, and maybe we can change that later. Another thing we want to change here is we want to keep track of the map index with this resource, which will be an unsigned int usize that just tells us which index in our vector of maps we are currently at. So now, and this is a little bit of a workaround. First of all, we're going to call maps here, and we're also going to call mapserver.mapIndex. So now this will grab whatever map is at map index whenever we call setup scene. Now, a couple of things. First of all, I bet if I run this, we can find some issues. Yes, indeed. There's a few places where we're calling. So BR map has a couple of issues and movement has an issue. So let's start with movement, since this is the same issue, maps. Now, this is a little bit sloppy. It probably would be a little cleaner to have a function on here that just says .current map, and then that way we don't have to worry about how it gets the current map, we just know that it is the current map. A small note, it's only repeated in 2 places so far, so it's not a huge deal. The other issue is in BR map, and that's just a naming issue, as well as not initializing map index to 0. So now this should be able to run, and it should still do the same thing since we're never changing what that map index is. Alright, and so it does. And now, another slightly awkward implementation. We can pull our map server into our adventure exit collide system as immutable and actually iterate that index while we switch to transitioning, thus loading the next level in the list. So that's increasing our map index by 1 and also playing it a little safe by moduloing that number by the total number of maps in our maps list so that even if we did get all the way up to the end, it would just start loading again from the beginning. Similar to what I said previously, this should probably also be in some function somewhere, so we don't have to worry about the nitty-gritty of this implementation just whenever we want to transition maps. But as of right now, the only place where we're transitioning maps is right here, so I don't have too big of an issue with it. So let's see if that works. Womp womp. Resource requested does not exist. See, the issue is that we're using the map server, but every time we use the map server, we need to remember to remind Bevy that this system only needs to be run after our maps have been loaded. So here we can remind it to only run if we're in the state map load done. Alright, we transitioned to the next level. A couple of issues we heard there. We noticed that our player started moving to the right at the beginning of the map, which is very strange, and is now glitched out because of that. The sound issues we'll fix in a second. First, let's fix the adventurer moving to the right. And I do believe that is actually just an issue of data. See here, in adventure, it's set to start by going to the right. So we actually need to start this going down. And I believe that's down. We'll see. Honestly, with the way that this configuration is set up, even if that's not down, it'll start by going up and then immediately realize it needs to be going down. So no big deal either way. There we go. We're not, of course, taking the portals because we haven't implemented that yet, but we've made it to a new level. Hooray! So let's get the background loop fixed here. Now there's two ways you can think of to do this, right? Because you're trying to delete all the things in the scene and then add all the things in the next scene. But you probably want to keep some of the things, right? Now, we don't currently have UI, but if we had UI, that would be one of the things we'd want to carry over. Another thing is a background loop for the music so it doesn't restart every level, because that would suck. Also, of course, the sound effects. So if there's currently a sound effect playing when we transition levels, we don't want to cut it off, such as the case with the exit noise. It's probably a little bit weird and inefficient to delete the camera and re-add it when it's just going to be in the same place and with the same settings anyway, so on and so forth. So the two ways to mainly do that are to either mark all of our entities that we want to delete, and then when we loop through those in our teardown scene system, we would just add the with that tag query to just get rid of only the things we've tagged for deletion. That could work, but in the way that this is implemented currently, that would be a little sloppy. For instance, just thinking about our mover hydrator, we'd have to also add a teardown tag to our mover hydrator, which now feels like a mix of concerns. And by a mix of concerns, I mean, if it's a piece of code that you look at and you wonder, well, why the heck are we doing that here? Like, what does that mean? That has no context for what we're doing here. Whereas currently in Mover Hydrator, direction is the way we're moving to start with, clockwise is the way we rotate, the coordinate is where we are to move from, target is the next move to, move percent is like a state that we're handling, so on and so forth. Those all make sense in terms of the movement file, but if we were to also add into that, don't delete me on scene load, now we're getting into extra knowledge of other things that we don't need to care about in this file. That logic might not make a whole lot of sense to you, and that's probably totally valid, but it makes sense to me. So we're going to actually do it the second way, which is what I might call the negative way, or adding a tag to everything we don't want to delete. That would be called something like no teardown. So let's create a no teardown tag. And then we're actually going to use that similarly to window here. So we don't want to tear down the window, obviously. But we also don't want to tear down anything we've marked as no teardown. And simple enough, we can come in here and include that in our camera 2D bundle, no teardown. We could put it in here with the create loop, but actually what I want to do is something a little bit more complex than that, since we also want it to be included in the create one shot. Let's actually return from audio bundle no teardown as well, like so. We need to import that, and we're not returning an audio bundle anymore. We're actually returning a tuple of audio bundle and no teardown. Might be slightly sloppy, but it's slightly sloppy in one spot. So with that, let's try running and see what happens when we get to the end of the level. Oh, issue. You can hear there that we actually have multiple background loops happening. And also, if we look at our warnings, Bevy's angry that we have multiple cameras too. And that's a pretty clear sign that something's wrong. And what's wrong is, obviously, whenever we set up scene, we're creating a new camera and we're also creating a new background loop. Down the line, there's definitely going to be a better solution for this. But for now, since we just want to get it working and we can fix it and refactor it later, the easy solution is to have a camera query that checks to see if we have a camera. And if we don't, then it creates the camera. And honestly, we can just piggyback on that and do the background loop too while we're at it. Like I said, a little sloppy, but let's see how that goes. Camera query get single returns an error if there is not exactly one entity that matches the query. A small room for bug here is that if there were multiple cameras, this would be still returning an error and we'd be spawning even more cameras and more loops in. But since this is the only place currently where we're spawning a camera, there's no reason for us to not just assume that if this is an error, that means that there are 0 cameras. Let's put our assumption here. Might as well document our assumption. Better to document our assumptions, especially when they are so egregious. This should solve the issue we were running into just a second ago. Let's see. Alright, I don't hear any duplicate background loops, and we're not getting any massive errors in our console, so I'd say that worked. Rad. And there we have scene transitions. A bit easier than I would expect them to be, especially given the fact that I was unable to find any built-in support for scene management. Technically, there is something called scenes, but I believe they're implemented with the goal of saving or loading scenes at runtime. We're kind of using tiled files as scene files instead of normal scene files that you'd see in Godot or Unity. So this is what we have so far, and we have a place to go and extend it if we need to. So I'd say that's fairly successful. So that does it for us today. Next time we're going to get started on our implementation for clickables, as this is supposed to be a clickable little crystal here that switches the portal from one side to the other. So next episode we'll get to work on that. Likely get as far as even having the portal switch from side to side, but we'll see. That's it for now. Thanks for watching. Peace.